Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Cannabis Marketing Live. I'm your host, Jake Litke, the CEO at Mediajel. And today we have Rudy Kellner from pFriem. pFriem? It's no, you don't say the P, right?
No, it's Freem, rhymes with dream. It's the
PFriem
easiest
rhymes with
way of
dream.
figured out how to train folks. It's just rhymes with dream.
Yeah, that is nice and easy to remember. pFriem is a craft brewery you're in Hood River, Oregon.
That's right.
Yeah. Normally we are talking to either companies in the cannabis space or companies in the sort of general marketing space. Um, I've been in the cannabis space now since, we started Mediajel about 8 years ago. There's always been a lot of conversation about the parallels between cannabis and craft brewing and to a certain extent wine, right? There's some natural reasons for that, but also cannabis follows kind of the same spectrum of you have, say, value brands, general market brands, and then you have, connoisseur brands or strains. And so I'm super excited that you're taking the time to talk about your business, and I think there's some parallels that will naturally evolve as we discuss between what happens in craft brewing and what happens in cannabis. But I'd like to start with talking about your brand, what your vision was, how you got started, and then we can dig into some details. And I do applaud you for choosing a brand name that has a non-obvious pronunciation, and I'm curious to get into how that's affected your brand identity. So,
Totally. Thanks for having me, Jake. Appreciate you. And kind of seeing the parallels between our businesses. I think there are some, and I hope to touch on those during our talk today. Um, a lot of the things I'll touch on today are kind of like foundational because I feel like, brand and who you are is really these are all foundational issues that have to be dealt with when you're starting a company, and that have to be dealt with when you're kind of creating the culture and creating the brand that you want to ultimately create. A lot of the things I'm passionate about and I'll talk about are, I think, pretty hard to implement when you're, like rounding second base on your business and you're kind of too far down the line. And I know we have, folks listening to this that are already established, but, I think there are lessons to learn as well. The funny thing that you mentioned our name, we chose the name pFriem Family Brewers because back in the hundreds of years ago when industrialized beer was starting to grow in Europe, which was the kind of the founding region of the beer business as it is. Brewers were only named after two things, back then, from a historical perspective, either the town that they were started in, or they were named after the founding brewmaster, the family name of the founding brewmaster. And back then, historically, these were all multi-generational businesses that were passed on from father to son typically, and through the family. And there are many examples of those out there where the companies still carry the name of the founding brewmaster, hundreds of years after they were founded. And when we were setting out to build pFriem Family, this company that ultimately became pFriem, our vision was to really replicate some of the legacy creation that our kind of forefathers in Europe created when they were starting their breweries, and we wanted to truly create a multi-generational, long-standing family, private kind of family brand. So to that end, we named it after Josh Pfriem, who was our founding brewmaster, still is, of course, our brewmaster, and he is like the life and soul of the company. And he has such a strong personality. He's such a strong presence in the beer business that really made sense to center the brand around him. He's got a funny last name, but and we were honestly somewhat concerned about that early on. But some of the folks we talked to told us that, what, it's an opportunity to have a conversation.
mhm.
It's an opportunity to tell the story, to correct the mispronunciation or to just explain the history of the name. And I somewhat was skeptical because I'm kind of like, that sounds hard. But we were working with some really smart marketers who said, you know what, you want that conversation. You want to be able to talk about that funny name that's hard to pronounce because that'll stick. And if you bring the product, behind it that is, that has a certain level of quality and a story, it's going to resonate with customers that are going to remember it. So that's kind of like the quick, part of the quick origin story, and how this name pFriem came to be, and how, we've told the story now thousands and thousands of times to folks out on the street, in tasting booths, in our restaurants. And it's unique, it's different, and that's, I think, one of the, reasons for our success.
Yeah, I think that's right. Anything that can invite a conversation, right? Because you
Indeed.
immediately you kind of sidestep a little bit of the normal funnel of awareness and then engagement, and you go right from people skip right into the engagement phase because now they're curious about something, right? And they want to understand the correct pronunciation, or what the origin story is, and now you've got them in a conversation.
Exactly, and even, to that end, some of our early merchandise in the early days, for the first couple of years, was Flemish and Belgian in nature, and the language on our early, some of our early T-shirts, it was Flemish words, right, and Flemish sentences, and people were like, "What is that?" Where'd you get that? And again, it invited conversation, and we really started, and I'll touch on this throughout the day today. We really touched, this all started like person to person marketing, word of mouth, on the street, bartender to bartender, and having these opportunities to have these kind of funny, nuanced conversations about some of these origin type of elements of the brand really did invite deeper relationships and created conversations that led to a deeper understanding of who we were and kind of how we thought about the product, less about, some sort of surface type stuff that I think some brands may get into if they don't really have a deep engaging story at the heart of it.
Yeah. And you mentioned bartender in there, so let's just dive into that. There's a very there's an important relationship in the cannabis industry and retail, which is that, you know, you don't really buy directly from brands generally, right? Within the
Yep.
cannabis space, partially because of regulation. So the point of contact outside of your marketing channels is generally the bud tender, right? As opposed to the bartender. And you mentioned the efforts you did in terms of educating the bartenders, which are going to be the ones when someone sits down at the bar and they say, "Oh, what is that beer?" or "Which beer I want, an IPA or a Kolsch or whatever it is." There's a conversation that happens with the bartender generally, right? And the same thing happens in the cannabis space. So let's dive into that a little bit, and how you nurtured that channel of contact with your customers.
Yeah, and I think if folks remember probably one thing from the hour we're about to spend, I think this should be it. I think understanding who your true salesperson is, who your true brand representative is on the ground, is one of the most important things you can take away, from this conversation. When we were building out our brand, we could have sold our beer, through grocery channels, supermarket channels, Albertsons, Safeway, Fred Meyer, Ralph's, whatever you may have in your town, right? Big supermarkets where people spend the majority of their money on beer, right? 80% of all beer purchases are made in those channels, right? In supermarkets, convenience stores, that kind of thing. Only 20% are made in bars and restaurants, right? However, we believe that for us to really establish a brand that'll last the test of time, you can't build a brand in the supermarket, right? There are hundreds of other beers on the shelf. There's no one there to talk about it, right? Your cashier at checkout isn't going to be able to tell you if this beer is good or not, right? By the time that transaction happens, it's too late. It's very transactional. So our goal, and for the first 2 years, we frankly didn't sell any of our beer through these bigger channels. It was all in the on-premise bars and restaurants. And even within that bar and restaurant channel, we were really picky. We chose the bars who had the bartenders who took the time to talk about the beer, the bars who really cared about the beer, not these, we didn't sell to sports bars, for example, right? We sold more to the connoisseur, high-end, quality-oriented bars, the connoisseur, high-end, more white tablecloth-oriented restaurants where you had, the beer equivalent to a som, right? and you were able to, really get the story, a story across. And one of the most important decisions we made was, we hired a couple folks early on. Our first, employees in the sales and marketing domain were folks who had been in beer sales and in beer education their whole lives. They had relationships with the influencer bartenders and all of the key influencer restaurant operators who really wanted a quality brand and who wanted something nuanced to talk about. And ultimately, these are the people that built our brand from the ground up. It was really the bartenders and getting them on board, getting them to understand the story, getting them to our facility and to see what we do, how we do it, to meet us, to get build relationships with us, allowed them to sell pFriem beer with confidence, and that started. That was the first domino to fall.
Yeah. And so, it's funny, we have I just circling back to something you said earlier, there's a bottle shop in the town I live in, and its name is Ool, right? But it's that Danish character, the
Uh-huh.
circle with a line through it,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
then the letter L. And of course, no one knows what that letter is, or most people don't know. And that is a similar thing, it invites a conversation about having a weird
yeah,
name. But then back on topic, locally here, I'm in the Bay Area, California. There is a similar situation. Like the one of my favorite beers is a brewery called Bear Bottle, and you can't buy that in the grocery store at all, right?
yeah.
You can. Total Wine has it sometimes down the road. No, they're actually opening a Bear Bottle like restaurant brewery in Walnut Creek. I just saw the sign go up, so I'm excited about that. Um, but today. What are your distribution channels? You talked about kind of how you started. You were specifically at higher end connoisseur type restaurants. Um, how did that evolution happen for retail today, and where are you today in terms of where your beer is being carried?
Yeah, I mean, it took, this is a 13-year long story, right? We were founded in 2012, 13 and a half years ago. And our channel strategy, it broadened out over time, but very, very slowly. We kind of started on the alleys and the side streets. We kind of grew it to the main surface streets and then the service roads and then, the 2-lane highway and then ultimately, kind of a 4-lane highway. But it took 13 years. I mean, today, we're at Costco in Seattle, for example, right? And we are at, in all Safeway Albertson stores in Oregon, and we are in most of the Albertson stores in Idaho, right? So we very carefully and very deliberately have grown the channel, but only at a pace that the channel, us from a production perspective, but also, the consumer could handle. I think moving too quickly through those channels, it's really easy to make those first sales, right? And if if you're running a company, a brewery, for example, and it's entirely driven by the sales organization, you're going to get ahead of it. You're going to go too quickly, and you're going to start selling your product into a channel that doesn't know you. And those first 6 months are easy, right? A buyer wants a new thing, right? You need to understand how this works, right? The store buyers, they want the new thing that they don't have yet. But if the customer doesn't know your brand, if you're not already established in the region, if you don't have the brand equity, the know-how, you're going to be off that shelf real fast. And when you get pulled off the shelf after those first 6 months, you're not going to get back in. And we see a lot of our, smaller peers make the mistake where, their salespeople are, they're paid on commission and they're hungry and they're driving, and they finally get their meeting with Safeway Albertsons, and they get placed into a store prematurely, and it just doesn't sell, right? The placement is the easy part. The rate of sale and the actual velocity is not driven by the placement. It's driven by the brand equity that you already have or don't have when you get on that shelf. And if you get ahead of it, you are screwed because you just basically screw that buyer, and that buyer is going to remember that they bought a product from you that didn't sell, and you're going to be punished for it for years on end. So you have to really understand your progression, and you've got to go really, in the beer business at least, you got to go really slowly through this channel expansion, progression.
Yeah. Last week we were talking with Dennis. It was really about, cannabis retail, but his big takeaway for brands was that for retailers, was that merchandising is important in the sense of the brands that you stock on your shelves. Now, if you are a brand and you're trying to find a good home for your product, and a lot of brands, there's more brands than there's space for shelves in California,
Yeah.
for example, right? So, in many ways, people will take any shelf they can get on. However, there's probably some thought to be put into what brands you're going to be next to, right? And what type of merchandising is that store doing? For yourself, you mentioned you started, on the craft connoisseur side. Was there, when you were evaluating which outlets to try to get distribution in, were there instances where you looked at a retailer and you just looked at it and said, this isn't where we want to be because we don't necessarily, they're going to take our bottle, you're going to put it on the shelf next to these other brands, and that's not really where we want our brand to be positioned? Is that a consideration you
Sure.
had?
Yeah, I mean, certainly. I think there are, there's some like volume considerations, right? Because some retailers are just too big. You just can't, you don't have the production volume to be able to satisfy them, and then you're running out of stocks, and then that's a whole, different hell to deal with. But for example, like there are some big box brands, like Walmart, and Bimart, and those kind of, big box brands that they do move a lot of beer, but frankly, they don't move very much premium beer and they don't move very much craft beer. And I think you have to, this touches on this idea of market segmentation. You have to really understand what segment of the market do I play in? We are not an industrial, large scale industrial beer producer, right? We are a relatively, we're large, regional, but we're still, we're in the craft beer business. Our consumer is not the whole universe of beer consumers. I'd like to think, oh, anybody who buys beer should be buying pFriem, but that's just not realistic, right? That's an idealistic, kind of fallacy you get into. So you really have to kind of build this thing inside out. And I go back to this connoisseur idea. The first probably 4 or 5 years where we made serious headway in retail, we were only in New Seasons and Whole Foods markets, right? These are kind of high dollar markets that attract, folks who have money, folks who like to buy expensive cheese, expensive meat, expensive wine, expensive beer. These are the folks who pay more for quality. So those are the folks that we were selling to, and that's where we were. And that was, that's the kind of retail equivalent of the bottle shop or of the connoisseur, bar or restaurant. The retail equivalent of that for us in Oregon and Washington was, Whole Foods and New Seasons. And again, it probably took us 9 or 10 years or 11 years for us to make our first sale to Costco, for example, right? Which is the other side of the spectrum, which is much more value driven. You don't go to Costco because you're looking for specific brands. You go to Costco because you're looking for, deals, right? And value. So I think that progression, and that progression that we took, I think is a good lesson, if you are trying to build a premium brand. Now, if you don't want to build a premium brand, we can talk about that too. Probably not the right progression, but my view is in today's market, also, I'm sure in cannabis, you really want to be on the premium side. The other side is real ugly. In beer, it is at least.
Yeah, it is. It can be for cannabis as well, and I guess we should talk about this because that's one of the things people came to hear is pricing and figuring out how you can be a premium brand.
Mhm.
In cannabis, you have two factors. You have what is essentially an agricultural commodity product that has historically been priced on the very high end due to scarcity. And you see this happen in each market, basically every state, right? The price per pound at wholesale drops very quickly as people get their production systems online. And so when you're selling your product on a shelf, you're always going to be competing with selling fundamentally the same product at dramatically different prices, right? So you have value brands in there, they're selling something for $25 and you're trying to sell the same thing for $60, right? If you're trying to offer a premium experience. In the craft brewing industry, what is the delta between, a six pack or a 12 pack of where your retail price point is versus what Coors Light or whatever this more volume type? I actually just don't know the answer. I'm curious as to what that spread is.
Yeah, I mean it's similar. I mean it's a 60 to 100% spread. You know, if and I haven't baselined it that specifically against some of those big brands because we fundamentally don't compete with them. You know, yes, people who buy beer will buy a 24 pack of Coors Light, but they fundamentally it's a different market segment. You know,
It is.
we're looking at only about, 12 to 14% of the total beer market, which is served by, true craft. So we're only kind of trying to touch one out of, every $8 that gets spent on beer, because the majority of the money that gets spent on beer is spent on, you know, I hate to say commodity beer, but it's, big beer, right? Industrial beer, Bud, Coors, Miller, those kind of beers, Modelo, even now. That's seven out of $8. Only one out of eight is being spent on craft. So, but those $7, that's a lot of money, right? And those guys are operating in a manufacturing scale. They're operating at a marketing scale, and they're operating at a cost per ounce that we would never be able to touch. And I think some people, I think in craft beer don't really see that. They don't understand that, and they try to chase those customers, and
Hmm.
they always fail, right? You will never get those customers at any reasonable scale. You'll never be able to achieve those economies of scale. And for you to try to play that pricing game, even remotely close, to me is an invitation for disaster, because you're going to price yourself out of your own margin, and then you're also going to price your brand out of any sort of um, uh, you know quality or premium sort of band as it is.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a conversation. I think what you said is really one thing you said. Well, not just one thing, but one of the things you said is important for people to think about, which is that not all the people out there are your customers, and they're not going to
Oh,
be. And as you know, when we engage with like let's say a newer retailer or newer brand, and we go through, sort of a brand activation exercise and ask questions about, who your consumer is. Um, when we are dealing with someone who maybe doesn't have really any marketing experience, especially like a smaller shop, they've they just don't have the background. Their first answer is always it's everyone, right? So say, who do
right.
you want to market to? They say, oh, everyone, right? And then they can come up with the sort of intuitive first big groups of, oh, we want college students and gamers and soccer moms, just kind of a little bit of marketing buzzword bingo that people have
Yeah,
heard.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Um, but both from a product delivery perspective and certainly from a marketing perspective, you can't try to address all those people. From a, you cannot market to everyone, and you cannot make a product that is going to be universally, have universal appeal to everyone. So when you look at your target consumer for your brand, I mean, you can say, okay, well, craft beer people, that's an
Mhm.
obvious one, people that like craft beer, but there are nuances to that in terms of inside of that, there's the sort of the tight circle of craft beer aficionados that are just, beer freaks, but then there's the larger circle of people that like higher quality products, either for themselves or they're going to a dinner party. They want to bring something that is, just it's a nicer product. How did you go about figuring out who those kind of sub facets were in that grouping for your brand specifically?
Yeah, and I think it's a wonderful question, and I think that's the thing that keeps us awake at night. Is I think those groupings and those market segments, the devil in it all is they're not static. They actually evolve as a particular market matures. They grow and shrink, right? I'll give you an example. I mean, when we opened the business in 2012, it was largely like a nerd aficionado, high end, like nerd driven business, right? Hoppy beer was all the rage. Belgian beers were all the rage, and it was really driven by aficionados. There were many of them, and they bought a lot of beer. But over time, those aficionados got older. Their tastes, their palates changed. Some styles went, in and out of style. And the reality is the high end kind of aficionado market has shrunk. So who do we market to now? It's really what we call craft beer explorers. it's the folks who are more in the middle of the market who are not experts at craft beer because now there's 10,000 craft breweries in the country now. There's actually a lot less innate expertise from a consumer perspective in craft beer. It's much more ubiquitous. So these are the folks who they drink craft beer as a matter of course because it's really readily available, but they don't really know as much about craft beer as the consumers did, 10, 15, 20 years ago, who were like really, really, really into craft beer. So we've had to change our messaging. We've had to change our approach. We've had to be, have styles of beer that are much more approachable, easier to drink, that are just like, more table beers. Now they're very well made table beers. They are marketed as being premium beers, like Pilsner, for example. 20 years ago, you wouldn't be able to sell a craft Pilsner. Craft beer drinkers didn't understand what a Pilsner really was. They only knew hoppy beer. And now craft Pilsner is the highest growing alcoholic craft category. So I think the key to understanding this is really seeing it not as a static, like a static, segmentation, and knowing that as these markets mature, the segmentation changes. What cannot change is, I think, your approach as a brand. You have to have a level of consistency in messaging about who we are and what is important to us. That cannot change. That has to be the same as it was on day one. But I think the product lineup that you have and some of the nuances of how you are speaking to these individual segments, that has to evolve as the market that you serve in, matures and changes over time.
Yeah, there's a couple other, inside of the cannabis space, there's two large buckets that people think of in terms of breaking down segments. You have the aficionados, whatever the heavy
Mm.
purchasers, and a lot of that can also be bucketed in the culture because cannabis has its own sort of culture that goes with it, for that core audience. And then there's what people have historically called the canna curious, right? Which is the people that don't know much about it. It can be a very complicated topic. That's where the bud tenders come in a lot with helping educate people. But I think that it's at least in mature states, this sort of middle child that people forget about, which is these are people that were kind of curious like 2 years ago, right? They're not super frequent shoppers and they're not purchasing a lot, but they've got enough experience under their belt. They have tried different things. They have a little bit of an idea of what types of things they like. And they are, in many ways, I think some of the best customers to go after from a brand perspective because they're no longer, they've gotten past the sort of fear and trepidation phase and they feel comfortable trying new things. And, for that market, I think there's probably a similar category inside of the beer audience where there are people that didn't ever drink craft beers that, someone introduced it to them. But then now that opens up sort of a different world where, okay, well, now that I know that I like these types of beers, well, there's like 1,000 to choose from, right? And how do you as a brand, try to capture that sort of post initiation, but not full
Yeah.
expert?
Totally. No, again, I think that's a really good insight. I think there's a couple things at play. One is as a brand, ideally, you're known as doing everything well, right? And that's like super loaded and it's really hard. But our goal when we set out to do this is to be able to produce a really broad range of styles and do it so well so that when somebody sees a pFriem tap handle from across the bar, and our first tap handles were these like dark wood tap handles that the style of beer was not evident, but the brand was very evident. And what we wanted to the point of that, similar to the funky pronunciation of our name, was if somebody saw a pFriem handle from across the bar, they didn't need to know if it was an IPA or a Japanese lager or a Mexican lager or some Belgian beer. They saw that handle, they knew it was pFriem, and it didn't care what it was. It was going to be really, really, really good. That's like one of the key things that we did early on was we our intense focus on quality, like religious focus on quality and differentiation, led us to the brand kind of leading the way and not necessarily particular styles leading the way. However, as we got bigger and as we started really kind of understand the nuances of these different consumer categories, what we realized was that there, the hardcore drinkers, like easy, right? They're going to drink IPAs. Then there's going to be the light beer drinkers. They're going to drink these lagers and pilsners. But, everybody's getting older, right? How are we capturing folks who are just, LDA, right? A legal drinking age, like now? And especially in beer now, in the last 5 years since COVID, beer's contracting, right? There are more people drinking beer now than ever. However, they're drinking less often, and they're drinking less when they do drink. So overall consumption is actually down about 4% a year, for the last 5 years, which is really, really scary because you're fighting for share in a contracting market. What you got to do then, in my view, is you have to realize, these older folks they're aging out, they're drinking less and less. You've got to capture younger consumers because that 23-year-old that may have his first sip of something from pFriem is going to be your customer for the next 35 to 40 years. That's your goal, right? So I think you have to understand and connect with young people and people off of the beaten path demographic. And for us, it's becoming clear that women are underserved in beer. They under index in Oregon craft beer, very much male dominated market. And then younger folks are drinking less and less beer. So a lot of our conversations, a lot of our thinking recently has been, how do we get more folks interested in craft beer, and what would they more likely drink? And the answer, for us has been, because we go to shows, we pour beer at tasting events, and we're out in the market a lot. Our salespeople, me, others, and we kind of see these folks from across the hall, and they come up to the booth, and we're like, I bet they're going to order a hazy IPA, right? Or I bet they're going to order like XYZ. And like truly they'll order the beer that we think they would because it's less of the traditional beer. It's less bitter or hoppy or resiny or whatever. There's more flavor. It's less beer flavor, and that's kind of the gateway beer. So we're starting to work on identifying what some of those gateway flavors are to attract the next generation of drinkers that we have to foster and get into the fold so that we have something to sell them, 30 years from now.
Yeah. And it's the kind of less beer tasting is an interesting angle, right? So
Yeah.
I'll give you an example. My wife does not like beer, except she likes stouts,
Yeah.
right? She will drink stouts and she will not drink any other beer, doesn't like the way it tastes, doesn't like the way it smells, right? But how do you get someone who's never had a stout because they look intimidating, right? There's really dark. You assume that that flavor profile is going to be very, strong,
Yeah.
but not in the way that it actually is. Um, Similar to, I will say, if we think about cannabis as, I think it's more product category, right? So there's edibles, gummies are like usually the first, if someone is, and the actual action of smoking, right? Actual flower is a big turnoff for a lot of people for some
Yeah.
obvious health reasons. So, they start with some gummies, which in and of themselves is quite a broad category, right? So you have the standard like distillate-based gummy, which are going to be less expensive. It's made from a distilled product. You could almost call that kind of like the commercial beer version of those products, whereas you have products that are made with live resin or live rosin, which is the actual, the plant itself compressed. That's going to be more similar to a craft beer because the botanicals are like preserved in that sense, and you get a different type of flavor, even if it's a fleeting moment because gummies are they don't stay in your
Yeah.
mouth very long. Um, but then you get into um, like those two different categories, and then there's different cannabinoids that are in them, and they have different actions that they take on the body.
Mm.
Now, I will also say that it's difficult for consumers because the messaging and description of what is in their products it can be very inconsistent and potentially misleading, depending on how the actual who's making the product and how they're marketing it. Um, but as you look at you know, getting your brand to your target consumer type. Let's say you've identified that. Actually, we didn't really answer that question. So we kind of talked about it from a high level, but let's just talk about today because things have shifted. If you are going into, let's say you're going to go in a new market. Let's say you were just going to go into a new state and you're going to start in bottle shops or high-end areas. Who are those consumers for you today that you think are going to be the most likely to engage? And then the second question is, how do you craft your messaging and marketing and like, bottle design or label design towards that audience?
Yeah. I mean, I think, for me, it's a bit of an easier answer because we have a brand that's, very well established as being, kind of a top shelf brand. That's who we want. But the reason it's been established that way is that's who we want it to be on day one. And we've been consistently doing the things that are required to be done to achieve and maintain that sort of top shelf premium status. My belief is that, for many craft producers, that's the only segment of the market you can really succeed in because that's where you have some hope in achieving gross margin and profitability, because you don't have that manufacturing scale. And I still believe that the folks spending money on craft beer will pay more for something better.
Mhm.
And fundamentally, you've got to be able to back that up, right? It's not about a funny name or pretty packaging. If the product is not fundamentally better, if it's not differentiated, and if it is not consistently, if it's not consistent, and again, consistently better than alternatives, consumers are going to give up on you real fast. So, I encourage everybody listening to be religiously committed to the product first and foremost, because if you don't have the product, everything else is it's temporary. I think it's window dressing. I think it'll come and I think things come and go. Again, making that first sale into a new state is easy. Making the second, third, fourth, fifth sale, that's the hard part. And the product has to stand up to uh, consumer scrutiny. I think customers are smarter now than they ever were. They have more choices, clearly, like objectively have more choices than they ever have. In the beer business, the scary part in the beer business isn't necessarily how many folks are making craft beer. There's 10,000 craft breweries in the country. The challenging part is that the consumer now has so many choices, that are adjacent. It's kind of like the gummy version of flour, right? You've got, cider, you have hard seltzer, there's just so many new different categories that will get you a similar buzz, a similar alcohol buzz at least to beer. So I have a strong belief that being premium and differentiating yourself on the product is the only way to, succeed in markets and to really enter new markets. So if we were in, and we've entered new markets recently, right? We entered LA a couple of years ago, and we didn't enter LA through, Ralph's superstores. We entered LA through the best bottle shops and the best beer-oriented bars and restaurants in LA, and we stayed there for about a year. We told our distributors, I don't even want to talk about chain stores. I don't want to talk about, all these grocery stores where yes, we can place the beer and yes, we can sell the beer. I don't think it's going to move because we really haven't established our brand identity and our brand equity in this new region. So you've got to take your time and you have to be really, really patient. Again, not to get into these bigger stores too quickly because the product won't move. If the product doesn't move, you're going to get pulled. If you get pulled, you're not going back in. So it's that slow, deliberate build through these like core influencer accounts. That's where you have to build a brand. You can't build your brand in stores where there's a million choices on the shelves and there's really no one to represent your brand at the point of sale.
Yeah, that makes sense. I've seen that happen with, people do get excited about, oh, I'm, gonna get on these shelves, but they don't do any marketing support or influencer support or bud tender education.
Yeah,
And they're surprised when it doesn't fly off the shelves, right? And
totally.
part of that is sort of a founder bias and optimism. You build your product, you believe in it, and you think that what you know in your head about your product is going to be evident to other people, and they're just not, right? They're not going to understand it unless you're doing something flashy to get attention. Um, and for the retailer, they don't want to keep stuff on their shelves that is not moving, right?
Absolutely.
So if you were to let's say you did not have a well-known brand. I guess LA is maybe an example of that. What are some strategies you would give people, either some things that were successful or maybe sometimes more valuable failures, where it would be you kind of your playbook of here's some things you should think about before trying to enter a new territory.
I think you have to really identify who, who are your salespeople? Who's going to really be touching and educating the consumer and like the front end of the customer interaction. I think understanding where and how customers ultimately make a decision, at the point of sale, it starts there, right? For us, again, it was those specialty bottle shops, restaurants, bars. We knew that we needed to build this thing inside out. So we went out and we found, through luck, through reputation, we found some of the most influential, wonderful, charismatic, educated, technical, well-connected folks to first like drink our Kool-Aid and believe in what we do, which we did, and then go out and get the front line, the soldiers, right? The infantry, right? The infantry of this war is the point of sale, and it's the bartender, it's the bartender, and we spent years and years, and we continue to do that. Because there are new bartenders now, right? People have moved on, and everybody has their pet brand. So you've got to keep re-educating and re-educating. So, evangelizing the brand to those frontline point of sale individuals who are going to be like, it's the jump ball, right? You've got 12 beers on draft. Somebody walks into a bar and doesn't really know what they want, and or they've never heard of this brand. The jump ball is that bartender saying, "Trust me, this is what you want," and then you've just created a new customer. That's my advice: is you've got to start with people in our business at least, and you have to really identify some special folks who can get your message across to the people on the front lines of the customer decision point.
Great. I just want to take a second and mention for those of you that are here in Zoom, there is a QA section. So if you have some questions for Rudy, you can type them in and we will get to them as time permits. Um, let's see where we were talking about new brands, getting into market. Let's talk about pricing some more. So you're at a premium price point, and inside of the cannabis industry, it's there's a lot of pressure, downward pressure on pricing, both from the wholesale costs through just competitive pricing
Yeah.
amongst brands, whether they're reducing their hard mark price or they are doing lots of sales, and then the retailers themselves are some of them are in very competitive markets, and they run into issues of they've got people down the street selling similar products for less. How have you dealt with and there must have been points in time where you thought, well, maybe we should reduce our price by a dollar or 50 cents, or I don't know what what those dials are for your particular industry. Can you walk me through what that experience was like, kind of, and did you actually experiment and move your prices up and down, and what effects did that have?
I mean, I think it's pricing is I think a function of which segment do I want to serve. If you want to be, if you want to serve the premium segment, if you want to, if you want to sell expensive cheese, and really nice cheese, like you've never, gone to a store and bought what you thought was really incredible cheese or meat or whatever, and felt like you got a really, really, really good deal, right? You're like, oh man, that's expensive. It's got to be good. I think there's a lot to that in the beer business. We've been very careful to be premium priced, not out of the stratosphere, because I think you could price yourself out of even premium markets, especially in in challenging economic times like I think we are in now. But I think it's hard to justify being a premium brand if you're not priced higher. If we are consistently priced higher than our peers, um, and I feel like our salespeople can justify that. And the reality is this: retailers like higher prices, right? If they can sell the product, they make more money on a higher priced product than on a lower priced product, right? I mean, they'll take more margin dollars on a higher priced product. So for us, I always want to maintain ourselves, on the high, in the high like 80th percentile of pricing. Like we want to live there because I think that justifies our premium brand. Um,
Mhm.
and it supports the notion that, we have good beer and it's therefore it's more expensive. Um, However, in the beer business, the use of sales and incentives is very widespread. And I think that's a big lever to use as you grow your brand and as you try to reach new customers, is doing incentives from time to time, doing sale programs from time to time, especially during holiday seasons. For us, it's Memorial Day, 4th of July, Thanksgiving, Christmas. There are certain, times of year where more people buy alcohol than other times. And you have to realize like, okay, your target market segment is more likely to expand, at least temporarily, in those times of year. So that's our time to touch new people. So, 4th of July, Memorial Day, I'm happy to put on sales and I'm really happy to eat margin because I know there are more people going to the store. They're not beer nerds that are this like bigger middle piece of the market. And if we're on sale at the right time, right place, I could get you to buy one of ours and you may really like it, hopefully, and then you'll become a Freem customer for life. So I think being very strategic in doing some discounting at the right times of year for the right reasons could be very helpful, and it doesn't damage the brand because then 2 weeks later you're back on normal price, your premium price. But you've just been able to get some new customers in by temporarily playing that game.
Yeah, that's a really good insight. There's definitely some similar things that happen within the cannabis space. You have the big days of the year are 420, right? April 20th.
Mm.
That's always everyone's biggest sale day, and everyone plans around that. It's kind of like Black Friday, but I don't know if you're aware of this. The Wednesday before Thanksgiving is Green Wednesday, which is
Ah,
coming up,
very nice.
and it
Well,
and it
well played.
is it is one of the other large shopping days, right? Because people are either buying. There's a variety of reasons it could be. Some of them
Well,
are
you
more
gotta deal with the in-laws, right? I mean,
right.
you want to
That's
deal with the in-laws, straight up. I get it.
yeah. You got to deal with the in-laws. Is one angle. The other is as cannabis becomes more socially acceptable, sometimes people are bringing it to share, right? To as instead of bringing a bottle of wine or a beer or alongside it. Um, and so your insight there is interesting because you have an opportunity as a premium brand. And I think people expect sales around that time because it's
Absolutely.
common to do, right? So you can probably pick up some people that maybe didn't want to make the investment, the extra $5 investment on a brand they weren't aware of. Maybe they've seen it, but they're going to take advantage of a discount on that day when they're already probably buying more and potentially to share and or for other people on that particular point in time. And then you have an opportunity to convert them into a customer without damaging your sort of your premium price point.
Absolutely. And I think again, there's real pricing strategy to it. In preparation for this conversation, for me, like pricing is really, really, really important because the minute you start chasing pricing like systematically, I think it's a downward spiral. It's really, really, really scary and dangerous. This idea that, oh, we're gonna just, lower prices and gain market share. It doesn't work because everybody else is going to lower prices. And the next thing you know, the whole segment is getting dragged down. And then, your margins are gone. So for me, there is very specific pricing strategy that can be used to, again, expand, temporarily expand the market set, bring new customers in, also reward retailers. Retailers in the beer business love sales, right? And because again they bring in, Safeway is competing with Fred Meyer, Costco is competing with Bimart. So you got to understand the retail environment. The retailers are competing with one another. So if you as a brand can work with a specific set of retailer and create a systematic, discount program over time to reward them, they're more likely to put more of your product on the shelf. They're more likely to take, like, if you have the next innovation, right? If I make the next beer or whatever, if I have a great relationship with a retailer because we've had this systematic pricing strategy together, they're going to take it because they want to, they want to reward me for rewarding them and working with them on price. So I think there's something to pricing strategy that has to be explored, but it's got to be very deliberate, and it can't be, like, oh my God, we're going to lower prices because everybody else is. That's dangerous, and that's really hard to justify continued premium positioning if you just keep sliding, where everybody else is, in my view.
Yeah, and also raising prices after lowering them is quite can be very damaging, right? I mentioned Dennis. We talked to him last week, and he told a story about it. They put a product out that was kind of a roll your own product, right? So it's kind of like a pouch, right? Instead of a pre-made product. And it was incredibly popular, right? They sold out of it almost instantly. So they did another run and they decided to raise the price, right? Because they figure, well, there's
Right.
demand here. We underpriced it. Well, when they brought it back out at a higher price, people were like furious. They had all kinds of backlash about how, they were bait and switching and
Yeah.
doing all this other stuff. And so price is a thing that people have emotional relationship to. And once you've, if other than a sale, right? A sale could make sense, but if you consistently decide to compete on price, and then you realize, 18 months down the road that that's not even a sustainable business model, digging yourself out of that becomes very difficult.
Yeah, it does become a challenging cycle. We, again, foundationally, we set out to build a premium brand, knowing that ultimately probably will cost us some business, and also that it would lead to, likely slower growth, right? But because we built our business to be, long game, multi-generational business, orientation, right? We I wasn't concerned about oh my God, could we have sold more beer in the first 5 years if we were a little bit cheaper? Absolutely. Um, was that going to get us to where we wanted to go and build a long term, premium business? That wasn't going to get us there. So we made choices deliberately in those early years to protect price, to protect the image, the brand, equity of the company, and to really build it, of course, at a cost, right? And I'm certain it came at a cost of some market share. It came at a cost of sales. We had a lot of grumpy salespeople who, we did not allow them to sell our beer into this, part of the channel that we talked about at the beginning. We had a lot of grumpy buyers who were like, "Oh, wow, you guys are too fancy, right? You won't sell me your beer." And we're like, "Sorry, we don't think of it that way." But part of it was, yeah, we took a more deliberate approach. So I think you have to really look at the integral under the curve on this thing and really be truthful with yourself as an owner. What am I in here for? What is my time horizon? And am I willing and patient to play a very long game? Then I think it's easy to defend price. If that's not your objective, and if you're not building a business for the long game, that's a whole different conversation that, I have a challenging time with because uh, it's tough for me to see that being successful in the beer business today. 25, 30 years ago, when it was like an entrepreneurial driven business and it was all up and to the right, you could do that well. But beer now is very mature, and I'm hearing similar threads from you, Jake, about the maturity of cannabis. I think you've got to look at it from a longer perspective now, as a retailer and as a brand.
Yeah, well, what's interesting about cannabis is it's basically like operating in different countries for each state inside the
Yeah.
United States. And not only are the laws different about what kind of marketing you can do or how much of what you can have in it, for example, like Michigan, the amount of milligrams that's allowed in a product is double what it is in California. So like what you're legally allowed to put in your packaging, it would kind of be like an ABV, right? Like what is
Yeah,
legal for beer to have in it. So those laws are different within different states. The pricing is dramatically different depending on how mature the state is. And then you have the growth cycle where you look at states like California, Colorado, Oregon, really the whole West Coast. Um, and Washington, where those states they're compressing in some ways, kind of like how you're mentioning the total amount of beer being purchased is shrinking, right? So, in those conditions, you do need to sort of deal with different scenarios, both from a pricing perspective. There's an analytics company that we talk to called Headset, and they measure everything, right? Basically the retailers connect their POS and they do analytics, but 20, I think the number was 23% is the average discount across the cannabis industry as a whole, nationally. And in like Missouri has the lowest discount rate right now at like 12%. And someone like Oregon, Washington, it can be as high as like 30%, right? And a lot
right.
of that is because you have both brands and retailers. You have more brands and retailers competing for a market that doesn't support all of them, right? So
Totally.
the first,
These are more developed markets than Missouri, right? And
yeah.
so the supply and demand hasn't sort of equalized yet in places like that. So you have, as a supplier, a lot more pricing power. Whereas in the Pacific Northwest and the West Coast, that ship has kind of sailed.
Yeah. But then there's also the other issue that the industry faces, which is the black market, right? Or the gray market. Or so imagine you're in the beer industry, but in addition to competing with people that actually have to get things certified and
Yeah,
there's stills are cleaned
right.
and all that stuff. Just imagine there's like an equal amount of people that are selling beer that are just making it in their garage
Totally.
and they're selling it,
You got
right? So
you got a lot of moonshine out there in the in the cannabis industry.
exactly, yeah.
Yeah, but I think totally. I mean, we all have, similar challenges, and I think the fundamental question, I pose to listeners is, um, are you, have you been clear with yourselves, with your companies about the brand that you want to build? And have you been clear about the timeline which you are willing to continue to invest to build that brand? And, I think that's where it all starts. And for us, our timeline was very long and our ambition was very high in terms of overall quality and, brand perception, and we were able to consistently make decisions, and we said a lot of no, right? I mean, the subtext to brand building, and you know this, Jake, as a CEO, right? Is you got to say no a lot. You say no to a lot of things that may get you business tomorrow, but it may not end up being a good decision, months, quarters, months, or years from now. And you've got to say no a lot. We've said no to lots of collaborations. We've said no to a lot of chain and retail placements. We've said no to a lot of things, and I think that's the discipline as an owner and as a leader to say no, where it doesn't seem like it aligns with your long-term objective. I think is a key factor in being able to grow a sustainable business over a long period of time.
Yeah, and it's hard to do. It's hard to
It's
turn
hard to
down
do. It's the hardest thing to
revenue.
do.
We've had, and it's something not all revenue is good revenue, right? Which is
100%.
something that
Yeah,
we've heard, and at least for our business, we can't necessarily work with sometimes newer companies, right? That aren't even really ready to do marketing will come and they want to do marketing, and we give them different advice, which is you should go invest those dollars in your brand identity first,
yeah,
or go invest those dollars in making your website more attractive and explaining your product better. Because if you're trying to do paid media into a funnel that doesn't work, you're just burning your dollars, right?
totally. Yep,
So,
absolutely.
we're up on time here, but since I have you, I have one last question, mostly for intellectual curiosity. Let's just do a little bonus couple of minutes here and talk about seltzers, right?
Uh-huh.
Because that's a bit, and there's a similar thing in the cannabis industry, which is the hemp. So there's licensed cannabis, right?
Yeah,
Legalized in various forms
yeah,
and factors. And then you've got this giant loophole that is being taken advantage. And there are the laws are shifting around like every week in different states and everywhere else. Um, but that's been a big impact on the beer industry, right? The
Yeah.
the wide popularity of seltzer.
Yeah.
Um, I don't even have a specific question other than how does that sort of weather change in the industry? How have you dealt with that?
I think you have to be aware of it. I think, as a leader, you can't put your head in the sand on anything, right? You have to be studying the market, studying the trends, who's buying this, what are the demographics, what are the price points, why are they buying this? During what occasions are these folks buying this? What is it replacing? What we've seen is generally the seltzers have been purchased by people who don't typically drink beer,
Mhm.
or they're very, very, very casual drinkers that'll drink, Coors Light, right? This is the best analogy I'll give you to a seltzer, I think, is you go to the soccer game, you go to the MLS game or the football game, and the folks that generally were buying Coors Light likely are now buying like White Claw, right? They really probably weren't into beer in the first place a lot. They just wanted to get a buzz. And for many people, the seltzer is it's fruity. It's like fruited alcohol water, right? And
Yeah.
it doesn't taste like vodka. So to us, what we've seen is seltzers have been mainly taking share from either big beer or taking share in segments of the market that were really not like very much craft centric. Now, have they impacted the growth of craft? Would some of those drinkers have maybe switched over from Coors Light, or Molson, whatever, to craft beer? For sure. And certainly it's stunted the growth of the craft market over the last, 5, 6, 7, 8 years. But there's a big war in the seltzer world. The big players, the Sam Adams, of the world, AB InBevs of the world. They're smart, and they saw seltzers rising very early. They made these big investments. So largely the seltzer market is owned by the very big players. And then you have a lot of craft brewers entering it because they need to keep factory utilization up. They've got to, keep tanks full, keep people busy. So there's a lot of micro entries into the seltzer market. I find it hard to see customer loyalty in seltzers. I feel like seltzers are it's a tool, but I have yet to find anybody that's particularly passionate about any seltzer brand. They seem very interchangeable to me, and very challenging to build real brand identity around. Maybe that'll change, but it's something that we're watching very closely. But because it seems to be a segment of the market that's less loyal to a particular brand, we're not interested in it. We want to be in segments of the market that drive loyalty to
Yeah.
Freem and to a brand. And I see seltzers as being very interchangeable. They're very transactional products at this point in time.
I applaud your diplomatic and neutral way of describing the situation. I know that as a beer aficionado, there's less kind ways you could describe the seltzer category.
There's a great beer writer. His name is Jeff Allworth. He's like one of the leading writers about beer, the beer business. And he wrote this maybe 4 or 5 years ago. He said, you know, I know a lot of people who are very passionate about beer and beer brands and styles of beer. I have yet to find a single person who's passionate about seltzer. A lot of people buy seltzer. There are billions of dollars of seltzer sold, right? But he said, and that's really resonated to me, is your goal as a brand is to find a way to connect, right? And to create some passionate connection between a consumer and the thing that you sell and the thing and the who you are. And I have to concur with Jeff. I really haven't seen that passion around seltzer yet, and that's what makes it a little bit. Doesn't make it interesting for us as a result.
There aren't seltzer tasting rooms popping up everywhere.
No,
Yeah.
no, no.
Yeah.
But there are a lot of 30 packs of seltzer in Costco, right? And I think and that tells you a lot, right?
Yep. That makes sense. All right. Well, I appreciate you giving us a couple more minutes here, and all the time that you gave today. Lots of interesting insights that I think are valuable, incredibly valuable to anyone trying to build a brand that's going to last. So
Wonderful. Jake, it's been my pleasure. Thanks for inviting me out and spending time with me.
absolutely. Have a great day, Reedy.
All right,
Thanks.
take care. See ya.
Bye.